On May 25, 2025, China sent 32 containers of cargo to Iran, 10,400 kilometers away. Not on a ship, not through any ocean, on a freight train that rolled through scorching deserts, cut across mountain ranges, passed through 4 separate countries, and arrived in just 15 days. The same journey by sea takes up to 40 days. That is not just an engineering achievement, that is a statement. For years, America's most powerful weapon against countries like Iran had nothing to do with missiles or soldiers. It was economic strangulation. Block a country's oil sales, freeze its bank accounts, cut it off from global markets, and watch it slowly run out of options. That strategy works because America controls the ocean. And if you need to move something in large quantities, you almost always have to use those waters. For Iran, every attempt to break free from that grip got pushed back until a freight train quietly proved that you do not need the ocean at all. China built a route that runs entirely over land through territory no Western Navy can patrol, arriving in Iran without a single dollar changing hands. The economic fence that took decades to build just had a massive hole punched through it, and that hole is only getting bigger. By the end of this video, you will understand how this railway was built, what it means for Iran's economy, and what China is really planning beyond this single route. There is a 5-nation expansion plan already moving forward. A frozen Arctic route being developed in parallel and a long-term strategy designed to shift global trade away from Western control. The railway is just the opening move. And if you want to follow how that strategy unfolds, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button so you do not miss what comes next. To understand why China had to make this move, you need to know about a single narrow stretch of water that quietly runs the world, the bottleneck nobody talks about. There is a passage of water in Southeast Asia that most people have never heard of, but almost everyone on Earth depends on without knowing it. It is called the Strait of Malacca. It sits between Malaysia and Indonesia, and it is one of the busiest waterways on the entire planet. Over 94,000 ships pass through it every single year. Oil tankers, cargo ships, container vessels, all of them funneling through one narrow corridor to move between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. For China, this waterway is not just important. It is a lifeline that keeps the entire economy breathing. About 80% of China's oil imports pass through this single passage. Everything runs on energy, and almost all of that energy depends on one bottleneck staying open. Think about what that exposure actually means. If the Strait of Malacca were closed for just 1 week, China could lose up to $64 million. A closure lasting longer would start shutting down factories, cutting fuel supplies, and hitting the daily lives of over 1 billion people. The world's second largest economy running on a single thread. Here is the part that kept Chinese planners awake at night. Since 2019, the United States has had the right to dock its warships and aircraft carriers at Singapore's deep-water naval bases. Singapore sits right at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca. In a serious conflict, the US could effectively close that passage within 24 hours. One decision in Washington and China's energy supply switches off like a light. What makes this vulnerability even harder to engineer around is that there is no easy maritime alternative. The Lombok Strait and the Sunda Strait can serve as backup routes, but both add thousands of kilometers to any journey and are not equipped to handle the volume of traffic that currently moves through Malacca. Rerouting even a fraction of China's oil supply through those alternatives would take years of port investment and logistical restructuring. China needed a route that no navy could threaten, no sanctions could reach, and no blockade could close. The answer was to leave the ocean behind entirely and build across land instead. And the only country whose geography made that possible was Iran, the railway nobody could block. Building a railway from China to Iran sounds straightforward on paper. In reality, it means crossing some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. Massive open deserts where sand shifts constantly beneath the surface. Mountain ranges sitting in earthquake-prone zones where the ground itself cannot always be trusted. Temperatures that crack concrete and warp metal. And the route passes through 4 different countries, each with its own borders, customs, rules, and railway gauges that were never originally designed to connect with each other. None of that stopped the builders. The railway begins in western China and heads westward across Kazakhstan, then through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan before finally crossing into Iran and arriving at the apron dry port near Thurun. 10,400 kilometers of connected track through terrain that most engineering teams would walk away from. To give that distance some context, it is roughly the same as flying from London to Los Angeles and still having hundreds of kilometers left to cover. The project cost upward of $2 billion. Funding came from Chinese policy banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and a mix of bilateral loan agreements. Solving the gauge mismatch between countries was itself a major engineering undertaking. Russia and Central Asia use a broader gauge than China, which means cargo either needs to be physically transferred to different carriages at borders or specialized bogie exchange systems have to be installed. So the same container can roll across different track widths. Automated bogie exchange stations were built at key border crossings, specifically for this corridor, cutting the time lost at transitions from hours to under 30 minutes. Because the terrain was so dangerous in certain sections, key stretches of the railway in Iran were built underground, not just to handle extreme weather, but to protect the line from potential airstrikes. That single decision tells you everything about how seriously both countries approached this project. This was not infrastructure built for convenience. It was built to survive a crisis. On May 25, 2025, the first freight train completed the full journey in 15 days. Before this railway existed, the same cargo would have traveled by ship through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Arabian Sea, and around the Persian Gulf before reaching an Iranian port. That sea journey took between 30 and 40 days. The railway cut it in half with no oceans, no naval patrols, no Western-controlled ports, and no enforceable sanctions standing in between. China's state media called this route the oil lifeline between the two nations. But what this railway means for Iran runs much deeper than a faster delivery schedule. Iran's lifeline and China's long game. Western sanctions have been grinding down Iran's economy for years. Banks were cut off from global financial networks. Companies that tried to do business with Tehran faced serious penalties from Washington. Oil buyers were warned away with threats of being locked out of U.S. markets. The message was simple and consistent. Trade with Iran and pay the price. China decided the price was worth it. Back in 2021, China and Iran signed a 5-year economic cooperation agreement worth $400 billion. That is not a routine trade deal. That is a generation-long commitment covering energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, and technology. In 2024, China bought 77% of all of Iran's crude oil exports, worth roughly $29 billion in a single year. Iran's total oil revenues in 2024 reached $67 billion, a level the country had not seen in over 10 years. The sanctions were still officially in place, but their real-world impact was shrinking fast. With the railway now running, those oil shipments do not need to pass through any route the West can monitor or disrupt. Iran loads oil onto trains. They roll east through Central Asian countryside and they arrive in China without a single Western bank or institution involved anywhere in the chain. That is not just trade. That is a completely parallel economic system operating outside the rules Washington built. A significant part of how that system functions is currency. China has been paying for Iranian oil in yuan since 2012, deliberately bypassing the US dollar. That might sound like a technical financial detail, but the long-term weight of it is enormous. The dollar's position as the world's default currency for energy trade is one of the most important pillars of American global influence. Every time a major oil deal settles in yuan instead, that pillar takes another quiet hit. Russia has pursued a similar strategy, settling a growing share of its energy exports in yuan and rubles rather than dollars. The combined trade volume flowing outside dollar systems has grown sharply since 2022, and this railway adds another layer to that trend. Iran's geography makes it even more valuable than just an oil source. The country sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. About 20% of all the world's oil passes through that strait. That location turns Iran into a natural gateway for the entire region. Countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan are completely landlocked. Through Iran's ports and China's growing rail network, those countries gain real economic connections for the first time. And China gains deeper political and economic influence across a region that has traditionally operated within Western spheres of power: the Five Nations Plan and the Frozen Highway. The Five Nations Railway Corridor is what comes after the China-Iran link. It connects China, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Iran in one continuous rail network stretching around 1,300 kilometers of new track, with roughly half of it running through northern Afghanistan. A preliminary agreement was signed back in December 2014, and while progress has been gradual, it has never stopped. In May 2023, the first test cargo ran from Iran into Afghanistan along a section called the Kauf-Herat Railway. That single shipment carried 655 tons of railway equipment, the very tools needed to build more of the network. The railway was quite literally constructing itself, one delivery at a time. Senior officials from Iran, China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Turkey all met in Thran in May 2025, focused on expanding this transcontinental network even further. The momentum is real, and it is accelerating. For the landlocked nations involved, this corridor solves a problem they have carried since becoming independent countries. A rail link through Iran to Persian Gulf ports changes their economic reality completely, and China deepens its influence across the entire region in the process. The financial architecture supporting this expansion is also worth noting. China's Belt and Road Initiative has committed over $1 trillion globally to infrastructure projects since its launch in 2013. Central Asia is one of its most strategically concentrated investment zones. The loans attached to these railway deals often come with long repayment windows and infrastructure for resources agreements, giving China a durable foothold in countries that previously had few other large-scale partners willing to invest. At the same time, China is developing a route going in a completely opposite direction through the frozen Arctic. The Northern Sea Route runs along the northern coast of Russia through the Arctic Ocean and is the most direct shipping path between Asia and Europe, cutting the journey from around 45 days via the Suez Canal down to roughly 30 days. The obstacle has always been the ice. Until recently, the Arctic route was only usable for around 88 days per year. That window is growing. As global temperatures rise, Arctic ice is retreating earlier and returning later each year. The usable window has now stretched to between 90 and 100 days annually. Russia and China signed a formal agreement in June 2024 to build a year-round container shipping line through the Arctic, with scientists projecting that by the end of this century, the route could stay open all year long. To navigate the ice that remains, Russia has built the most powerful icebreakers ever made. The Arctica weighs 33,000 tons, runs on 2 nuclear reactors, and can crush through ice up to 3 meters thick at a steady, continuous speed. It can run for 7 full years without refueling. Its sister ship, the Sibir, handles both open Arctic waters and the shallower coastal zones along the northern coastline. Russia keeps releasing newer and more capable versions, each one pushing further into territory that was previously unreachable. What is particularly significant about the Arctic route is who it cuts out. The Suez Canal is operated under Egyptian authority, but sits within a zone of deep Western diplomatic and financial influence. Insurance, financing, and logistics for ships using Suez run overwhelmingly through European and American institutions. A viable Arctic route bypasses all of that. Together, 2 routes are taking shape. One cutting through the heart of Central Asia, one pushing through the frozen north, and both leading away from the oceans and financial systems the West has shaped for generations. What this all really means. The honest truth is that this railway cannot replace ocean shipping on its own. A single supertanker carries 2 million barrels of oil, the equivalent of hundreds of freight trains. Scaling rail to fully match maritime trade is simply not possible in the near term. Multiple border crossings mean customs checks and coordination delays. Desert heat and sandstorms wear down tracks quickly. Fixed rail lines are easier to target than ships on open water, and the early results reflected exactly those vulnerabilities. Just 19 days after the railway launched its first freight service, Israel conducted a large-scale attack targeting Iranian oil and gas infrastructure. No further public freight services on the corridor were reported after those strikes. The railway stalled almost as quickly as it started, but all of that misses the deeper point entirely. This railway does not need to replace sea routes to matter. It just needs to exist and work well enough to give both sides options they never had before. When China has a functioning land route for its energy supply, the threat of a naval blockade at Malha carries less weight. When Iran has a committed buyer operating outside Western financial systems, sanctions lose their grip. When landlocked Central Asian nations gain rail connections to global markets, they gain the ability to choose their own partners on their own terms. None of these shifts happen in a single dramatic moment. They happen steadily, quietly, one freight train at a time. There is also a signaling dimension that pure economics cannot capture. Every kilometer of track laid by China in Central Asia sends a message to smaller countries watching from the sidelines. There is another option. You do not have to structure your trade, your debt, your infrastructure, or your foreign policy around the preferences of Washington or Brussels. That message, even without being stated directly, is one of the most consequential things this railway communicates. What America is watching is not simply a railway. It is the slow but deliberate construction of an alternative to a system the West spent generations building and defending. A system built on naval dominance, dollar dependency, and control over the choke points of global trade. What China, Iran, Russia, and Central Asian nations are building together is a parallel answer to that system. It is incomplete. It faces real and serious obstacles. But it is growing, and it is operating in places where the old rules simply do not reach. Infrastructure is never just infrastructure. Every tunnel dug, every kilometer of track laid, every nuclear-powered icebreaker launched carries a message. It says the world does not have to work the way it always has. The countries watching from Washington understand exactly what that message means, and so do the countries building. If this video gave you a new way of looking at global trade, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. We will keep tracking how these new routes develop and what they mean for the rest of the world. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Do you believe a land route across Central Asia and a frozen Arctic highway can ever seriously challenge the dominance of the world's oceans? Or is the sea still the king of global trade?